Ganesh, can you tell me a little bit more about Gramener and just about the data work that you do with clients?
Sure. I mentioned about enabling decision making for our clients. So typically organizations reach out to us with either a very specific statement saying, hey, we have this challenge with our workforce. We want to engage our people better or retain the workforce. So that's a very specific problem statement. We bring in the relevant analytics, start with the business problem, bring in the relevant analytics, and we also convert those insights into data stories. And we make this repeatable end to end by using a low code platform, by creating a custom data science application. And there are other clients who come in with a very broader statement saying, hey, we heard about data science. We want to get into the bandwagon. Where should we start? So that way, helping them chart out a path with data, define the data strategy, create a roadmap, pick high impact projects, and also help them mature along the way. How do you drive a culture of data driven decision making within the organization? So that's where the advisory and consulting component comes in, and we match that with the implementation, hands-on implementation, and building the solutions for our clients. And some examples of clients like Deloitte, EY, Microsoft, World Bank. So these are some of the clients we've been working with.
That's awesome. That's super cool. So, with a lot of this technology, it's very up and coming. I feel that you see a lot of businesses a little hesitant. So tell me a little bit about the challenges that you faced or struggled with some of the clients in that manual effort with business operations and data.
Yeah. The primary challenge when it comes to data science is with adoption. So organizations can have the best of solutions, might have great data scientists, but how do you get the business teams on the ground to use the solutions? That's number one challenge. So how do you solve that? You'll have to identify what are those pain points the users are facing, and if you can address those pain points and give a solution, then there's a higher chance that they would latch onto it. And number two, anything that you create has to go into the workflow. Let's take the example of, say, scheduling activities for the workforce. Typically, when people run AI or machine learning pilots, they would create a separate solution standalone and say, hey, come here, and then we will key in the details and we'll give you a recommendation, and then you go and implement it as part of your day-to-day activities. That just doesn't work. You need to have it as integrated as part of your core workforce management solution, so that as people are doing the regular allocation, there's a smart prompt, a recommendation which says that, hey, if you allocate this task to this particular person, it's likely to be much more efficient. Or it gives a prompt saying that you're likely to run out of capacity today, so you might want to plan and maybe onboard some additional workers for today to make sure you are able to deliver the commitments.
I'm glad you made that point, Ganesh, because it's something that we've certainly observed as well, is that if you have enough data and enough understanding of the challenges of your workforce and also of demand or whatever else is impacting your ability to supply labor, you can always go find a consultant who will create a model of here's the resourcing you need and here's how it should be allocated. But you're so right, like unless that model can be put into practice, then it's kind of just like an academic exercise that people on the front lines who are actually doing the work don't really benefit from. So I'm curious to hear how you have, what's been your approach to actually getting these models? I mean, how have you found is the best way to sort of get this work actually like put to the front line and actually be taken advantage of by end users? Sounds like it's mostly tried through end-to-end platforms is kind of what you're going for, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me give you an example. This is a work we are doing with a cold chain warehouse in the US. And they were using a traditional workforce management solution, a WMS, where they manually allocate tasks to the people, and they have customers dropping off their goods for cold storage. Imagine a retailer dropping off some frozen foods, and they store it there for a couple of days, and then they come back, and when they're ready to pick it up, they send a truck, get it and ship it to the store. So the moment a truck comes to the warehouse, they want the turnaround time to be very rapid. It should be able to quickly unload it, store it, and when it comes back for pickup, they should be able to quickly load it back. So how do you pick the right appointment slot is one challenge. And once you have a truck coming in, how do you allocate the work to the people to make sure you're able to meet the target SLA turn times?
Mhm.
So these are practical challenges. And now we built a data science solution which was able to identify the best appointment for the shortest turn time. So this was not just able to recommend the appointment, but also used to give the flexibility to the people in case you want to pick a second appointment for whatever reason. Not this slot, I want to do it instead of 3 p.m. I want to do it at 5 p.m. It runs the model again and says, if you do it for 5 p.m., this is likely to be your turn time, and this is how it will impact the rest of the activities for the day. So far the solution looks fine, but the key thing is how do you integrate it? Back to your question. The, Initially, in the pilot stages, we had it separately just to test it out whether it was working fine. And obviously, the adoption was low because people had to come into the WMS and make the allocation. They used to go to a separate screen, check the recommendation, and come back and do it. It's a lot of friction within this workflow. So eventually, once we were convinced and the users bought into it, then we integrated both of these solutions together. So the moment they are making a workforce allocation, immediately there is a prompt which comes and says that, hey, this is the number of appointments you have today. You might want to change this allocation this way, or this is the impact of your schedule. So we integrated this solution as part of the workforce management solution, the warehouse management solution. And then things became a lot more smoother. And eventually, we realized that the people were not even aware that there was a data science background solution in the background. It was just like business as usual. We come in and there's some prompt, we either accept it or reject it, and then move on with the job. So that makes it very seamless.
That's the key, isn't it? I mean, the way we try to position it inside our product is, I'm a frontline manager in a hospital or in a store or in a warehouse or whatever, and I'm doing my scheduling, and it's the shifts are being created correctly and the right people are being allocated for them. And the fact that there is like an algorithm or a tool or something in the background that determines how that is done shouldn't be that's not something I should need to worry about. It should just kind of work. And I think it's certainly, I mean, there's a place obviously for head offices to do the data modeling and to work with partners like yourselves to sort of come up with the right model or the right system to recommend the right person for the right task. But from a frontline perspective, as soon as you're making people think about that and creating extra challenges for them, it just gets in the way of the job being done, and people lose trust in it because no one wants to believe that there's like this robot doing their scheduling for them. People want to still have that autonomy about it, but also it's like you want to be assisted at the same time. It's like an e-bike.
Yeah, very true. The keyword is augmented intelligence. It's not just artificial intelligence, how you augment it with human decisions. And the key thing that we usually emphasize is how do you keep humans in the loop? Yes, we can have best of recommendations, but humans should be able to override it. And when they override it, they should be shown the implications of overriding it. And if they still decide to go ahead, then so be it.
I'm curious how you find this works. I mean, so the classic academic examples for automated scheduling are for nurses. It's the most common research paper, and then also for warehouses and logistics. And I mean, I hope you guys can solve the supply chain shortage. But how do you find this sort of stuff works in industries where it's not so where demand is not so clear cut and it's not not so much on a pre-booked sort of task basis? If that makes sense. And I guess the example I'm thinking of is like restaurants or quick service restaurants specifically, or bars or other places where demand is highly they're dependent on things that are very, very hard to predict ahead of time or could just appear to be totally random. Yeah. Do you take this on the same approach, or how do you approach that sort of stuff?
Yeah, in fact, the early stages of COVID, March, April 2020, we had the same challenge in almost every industry. You couldn't predict the demand. There were some industries, there was an unusually high demand, and others like travel, it was a big drop. So at that time, we built a solution, a demand supply solution. You need to do a couple of things. One, you need to look at it from the demand side of the things to find out what are the factors which can likely impact your demand. It could be weather, it could be external factors like the health emergencies, or it could be some customer related factors. You collect all of that data. And then the other side of the equation, supply. what is the availability of people, and what could impact the availability, the productivity, and things like that. When you bring both of these together and you're able to make, for instance, it could be a forecasting solution which forecasts the demand, forecasts the supply availability, and then you match both of these together and say, historically, this is the demand, and it is likely to be unusually high or unusually low today. And this is an additional number of people you need. And in terms of industries, yeah, this would be very relevant for restaurants. And even recently, we worked with a software organization. So it's a very different industry, but here again, there was variability in terms of projects coming in, the kind of skill sets you need, and with high attrition, availability of people. So that also becomes a challenge. So this is common across a lot of industries, and it's unpredictable, but with forecasting, and when you bring all these factors together, you can manage it better.
So is this all based on quantitative data, would you say?
Yeah, it's mostly based on quantitative data, but there could be other signals that you can always ingest. For instance, you have um, uh, say visual geospatial data, which is not
Okay.
very quantitative to start off with, but satellite imagery, and these data can also be used as inputs. For instance, Google does this by looking at the traffic, and there's likely to be a congestion. Some of it is based on what vehicles report back, but some of it also could be based on audio, visual, and geospatial inputs.
Yeah, something we've found to be incredibly empowering is, we've been working with researchers from the University of Chicago. That's kind of why I know more than I'd like to about the academic research around automated scheduling. And I think the next frontier that they're really trying to understand is the qualitative side of this, which the easiest way to explain it is like, how can you infer that John and Dave don't like working together because one time John tried to go on a date with Dave's girlfriend, and you like in academia that stuff doesn't happen very much for whatever reason, but in the real world it really does. And so I think like that's the next frontier, I guess, of scheduling challenges and of trying to make it easier for the right people to get scheduled for every shift and make it as efficient as possible is kind of in that space. So we've found it to be a really interesting area to try to go a lot deeper on. We've been working with a bunch of research from there and some, I guess, spin-offs out of the university that are trying to, I guess, use machine learning to learn these sort of patterns more effectively. And I don't really like to call anything machine learning because mostly it's just a fad. But 1 in 10 times it's actually a good use of technology. So it's interesting to see how there's a lot of thought that goes into how to do this stuff quantitatively, and if you have enough data and understand your business and demand and so forth enough, you can theoretically project anything. But it was, as we all saw with COVID, like there's always something you can't predict.
Right.
So there's always limits to a quantitative approach, but what you can always try to do is learn the general behavior of how scheduling is done, and then augment that with technology. I think that's kind of a really exciting area that we're trying to and push the envelope on a little bit if we can.
Yeah, I'm very curious of the industries you work, you serve clients in. Which of these do you see has a greater adoption of such workforce scheduling solutions, and particularly if you talk about this automated workforce scheduling?
Sure. Yeah. Let me give you two very different examples. The first one is a chain of pizza stores. They cannot be named. And what they kind of, it's pizza, right? Like you go online and you order it, and you always order it between 5 o'clock and 7 o'clock on a Friday or Saturday night. It turns out is basically what happens. So you'd think it's really, really predictable. When we started working with them 5 years ago, they were trying to use a system that really just made those predictions. And then they had done like a time and motion study, and they found exactly how long it takes somebody to make a pizza. And from that, they kind of assumed that, okay, well, I guess we can accurately project how many people we need working at any one time. And we did some sort of, we helped them come up with an algorithm that did those calculations and created shifts for them. And what we found was that when we'd deploy that into production, and then end users would go and click a button and it would make their schedule, and it would create a schedule with, let's say, I don't know, 40 hours worked in a week or whatever, something like that. And then that everyone was like, oh, cool, that's great. It's cheap, it's efficient, like it's ticking all the boxes. And then you go back and look a week later, and like managers had gone and made changes to the schedule. People had worked times different to what was scheduled. And the reality is there was about 30% of the reality was about 30% more hours worked. So we kind of found that there was like this huge there was let's call it 30% dead weight loss, basically, which was time that was being not accounted for or not planned for, that was still being worked and still being paid for. And the big conclusion we drew from that was that despite them knowing exactly how long it takes to make a pizza and exactly how many pizzas they'll sell, there's obviously other things they didn't know ahead of time that impacted the realities of how their work was done. So that is what led us to looking at a more machine learning based approach, where rather than trying to do this is going to get a bit technical. Rather than trying to do a mathematical optimization, we instead tried to learn how managers actually scheduled and what they did in the past. And then rather than trying to start with the cheapest and most cutthroat effective possible set of shifts, we started from the basis of like what this schedule should look like based on how we know the manager works. And then where can we make it like 5-10% more efficient at a time? And so what that led to is the initial output was, let's call it like 10% more shifts and 10% more expensive than the output from the old algorithm, but it actually got used and people didn't make changes to it. But then we found the same sort of approach works really well in industries like in healthcare, where we find that actually like you can sort of predict what's going to happen, but then anything can change in an instant. There's like a lot of uncertainty around exactly what's going to happen on the day compared to pizza. And we found it works just as well in parking lots and in swimming pools and other very random, seemingly unrelated industries, which was kind of a surprise.
Yeah, that's good to know. Interesting. I think
we have a question here for you.
Yeah,
go for it.
Praveen asks, can you elaborate on the case you mentioned in the IT company? So, sure. So this was the challenge faced by the company. They had several projects incoming, and for a given project, they needed a mix of skills. For instance, say Java, you need certain testing skills, and you need .NET. So there are different skill sets required. Finding out the team with all these skill sets is extremely important within a certain duration. Otherwise, you would lose the project. So identification of people, particularly when you have, in this case, the organization had tens of thousands of people. Finding out which are the people who had these skill sets and are they available. And similarly, planning ahead for the next 10 to 15 projects. It's always a struggle. Like you may not know until at times a few weeks ahead that this project is coming in, and you already have people allocated for 6 months or 1 year to another project. So in this case, a few things were important. Number one, identifying the availability of people, the skill sets of people. Maintaining a skill repository was very important and making it up to date. So that's number one, to make sure you have the data on the supply side of equation. Like who are the people available and what skill sets do they have? And second, looking at the demand, what kind of projects are likely to come, and typically what projects we've been getting at this time of the year, and from these clients. So here again, it goes back to understanding the supply side, understanding the demand side, and then we were able to do a recommendation for a given project for these skill sets. These are the most likely people who are immediately available or who are likely to come out from their earlier project. So that way, you get a sense of whether, even if they are not immediately available, in 2 weeks, you will be able to staff this project. Or if there is a project which you won't be able to staff for the next 2 to 3 months, look at channels for hiring. Can you hire and get some people on board? If not, then should you even push this out and talk to the customer and set the expectation? So that way, a combination of getting the data right and making sure it was followed within the organization, that's most important, and data sanity. Number two, some forecasting on the demand and supply side. And finally, recommendation, that when you match all of this is likely to be the availability. You either go and accept the project or you make these alternate decisions. So that's how we solve this challenge.
Interesting. Travis had a really awesome question in the chat. He said, how are companies able to calculate their labor standards if they're also incorporating so much qualitative data? That's really interesting because, I think with a lot of, we were kind of talking about going back to COVID, a lot of things are changing and constantly changing, and qualitative data has to feed into that through a very mathematical sense. So, Alex, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I feel like this one was targeted at me. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think, in the industries we work, and we specialize in places where people get paid by the hour, and particularly in frontline workforces. So the last 2
Right.
years has been a bit crazy for us. But in the industries that we work with the most, everyone really, really wants to know, really wants to be able to say, like, we have like a set, whether it's sales per labor hour or something else, where we can turn labor hours into revenue with a reliable metric. Everyone really wants that number, and they want the number to go up. And I don't blame them. I think what we've found is, like, what's challenging in reality is it's really, really compelling to pretend that if you just take a quantitative view of the world and just look at all the data that you have collected, you can make an accurate projection of the future. And you can then you can tell yourself, this will be our labor standard. And, like, it's, people like to make plans, but then if you don't actually assess your plan against what happened in reality, then it's not a very useful exercise. And what we've learned is that trying to take an exclusively quantitative view of the world and trying to just look at the data you've collected to project what's going to happen, inherently is never going to give you an accurate projection of reality. And it's really, really risky if you plan around that. And so, like, a really simplified example is, if I budget to spend $100 tomorrow, and then I put all of my bank account minus $100 into Bitcoin, and then I spend $110, I'm going to have no money, and Bitcoin's probably going to go down. So you can't just make plans and then hope that they'll come true and never assess them against what actually happens. So what we have really been trying to focus on and working with our customers on is trying to have a bit more, let's call it, wiggle room, where you're still trying to optimize costs. You want to do the most efficient job you can, and you want to increase your revenue per labor hour, but don't focus so much on, like, what it's going to be projected to be. Focus more on what it has been in the past, how you can learn from that, and how you can make, like, sort of how every week you can make small improvements and modifications that are going to improve that metric over time. And I know it's really compelling when you go to a board, if you go to an executive meeting or whatever, and you can say, like, oh, we're going to schedule our team so well in the next quarter that it's going to be this profitable. It's much nicer to go and be like, hey, we actually did this and it actually got results. And I think there's a pretty big chasm in the industry between like plans that look really good and then actual like outcomes in reality that are really effective. Which I think it's not, like, it's obviously not as exciting to talk about, like, having to wait a little while and do things properly to wait for the payoff, but it's certainly more worthwhile in the long run. And I think particularly in today's environment where everything's changing all the time, and there's a lot of challenges in the frontline workforce as it is, I think anything that you're doing that's, like, really dependent on a lot of luck to succeed is not really a very good strategy.
It's very true. We do have a little poll question for everybody. It's asking, do you utilize any data analytics yourself, forecasting in any of your scheduling practices? Feel free to cast your vote there. And then, Ganesh, I don't know if you have any added thoughts on that, to Travis's question.
I had one that not exactly in qualitative data, but generally I wanted to expand the answer that Alex gave to using publicly available data. That's one aspect which I find organizations don't tap into. When you talk about data, they only look at what they've already collected internally. Public data can be extremely useful, whether it's quantitative or qualitative data. Give you an example. Last year, the early stages of the pandemic, healthcare organizations and governments were running blind. They didn't know when COVID will strike or where it will strike next, which county, which state. At that time, there was this small company, a thermometer company, which was able to predict the next epicenter of COVID. This surprised a lot of people, and eventually researchers got pretty excited. How did they do that? they had these internet connected thermometers. When people take the thermometer readings, it uploads the data onto the cloud. Like Kinsa thermometers, if you've used, it does that. And they had over 1 million thermometers across all of US. So with temperature being one of the early effects when someone catches COVID, so they were able to find out when the temperature rises were unusual. There was this flu season, but they know that there is a 200% increase in temperatures in unusually in this county. So that's why they do this analysis and find out that this is unusually high. And given COVID, it's most likely to be the next epicenter. And they predicted, for instance, South Florida. At that time, Florida was not impacted yet. So they predicted that there's been a lot of high temperature readings in Florida. It's likely to get impacted. In a few days, it became the epicenter. So this is an example of how you can use public data, anonymized, and use it in completely different ways and get insights where CDC was not able to do anything beyond 2 weeks historical data. Here they were predicting a week ahead with public data.
Yeah, it's a pretty good example. And I think it's kind of, I mean, it's kind of relevant to the poll, I guess, because the question is, if you're utilizing forecasting or data analytics, in my experience, it's tempting to have an internal data team and tell that team to analyze all the data you've collected internally, like you said. And it's not so easy to go out and look at the outside world. And the thing that we found really interesting is, as a software vendor working across thousands of customers, we can look at the same data set once and then apply it to everybody. And so we can look at the same weather forecast for every customer that's in Florida, and we can infer the same. But for some people, if it's raining, that's really good. Like if you're a cinema, and for some people, if it's raining, that's really bad. Like if you're an ice cream shop. So we can learn different things based on the same weather set, but we can do it in a much more automated way. Where particularly if if you're not such a large organization that you don't have a dedicated software team or dedicated data team, it's good to think about public data, but it's not so practical to actually go do it. And I think in this sort of, I guess, for lack of a better word, mid-market space of companies that are big enough to really invest in automation, but not so big that they have the internal expertise to do it. Yeah. I think that's where there's a lot of opportunities to develop better products, which can go and look at public data sets and can learn more about the world. And these companies really benefit from working with vendors where they are able to share this knowledge across lots of customers, and because that rising tide lifts up everyone who buys into it.
Yeah, very true. And I often say that today to use machine learning, you don't have to have the in-house data scientist expertise. Most of the tools
I would say you shouldn't. I would say honestly, it could be a detriment to doing it all in-house, because it biases your view of the world too much.
Absolutely, yeah. So there are chances that the tools that you're already using have incorporated some elements of smart recommendations. So that would be one place to look at. And second, there are several like SaaS tools available on a subscription basis on the market, like yours. So that's another avenue in case they don't have it in the tools they're already using. If these two options they've exhausted and they don't have available to use, only then you should look at building some solution in-house. Otherwise, I think it doesn't make sense.
I'm curious your view on the people who have said no to this poll, and maybe some of them might shout out in the chat if they can add any more context around it. But what's your advice, I guess, to people who aren't using any forecasting or data analytics at the moment, without knowing anything else about their company?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe we could, while we answer that, if we can also ask the people based on what they've heard so far, do they see promise in using analytics or forecasting as part of their scheduling? That will be good to know. Would love to hear if you're convinced yet or need more examples. Now, coming to your question, Alex, for organizations that are not using it, a simple way to do that would be assuming they're using Excel. I already mentioned two options. Like one is look at the tools you already have. Either they might have an option to enable, or look out for such simple, inexpensive tools which you can directly subscribe to. Mm-hmm. Assuming these two options you've tried out. Another simple way to adopt this tools like Excel or Google Sheets. They also have forecasting inbuilt into it with simple formulae. You can just add and then you can extend it and build a moving average, or beyond that, like other algorithms are also available on demand. So you need analysts for that, people who have some background, but you don't need math, you don't need statistics background. People who have good business analysis background should be able to implement that on simple tools like Excel. So that's one option to look at. And when people think of forecasting analytics, they again make the mistake of thinking of only programming, or thinking of Python or other expensive Amazon or AWS kind of tools. You don't have to really look at those heavyweight lifting tools. Even simple tools like Excel, which you already have, might have the capabilities.
I think Praveen, I'll definitely get to your question in a sec, don't worry. But just to build on that point, I think the thing that I find really interesting and exciting about the customers that I work with is all of them really understand their business, and they're certainly like, whether or not they have 10,000 employees or 50, the level of savviness doesn't change, but the access to tools and resources and stuff changes a lot, as you said, between being able to really run being able to have a data forecasting team or just having access to Excel. But the most, I think, like, for all the hype around automated scheduling or any other such topic, the smartest person in the room is still the frontline manager. And as software vendors, it's our goal to empower them and to make their work more efficient and give them all the resources available to make better decisions. And it's not to replace them. So I think that's an important thing to sort of keep in mind. And so for people who are not using any data like forecasting or analytics tools, I mean, I think I say to them, like, that's not a bad thing. Good, first and foremost, empower the people on the front line who are actually doing the work, but then think about what tools you can give them to help them make a better, or, like, let's be honest, a more profitable decision day to day, without necessarily worrying too much about without trying to worry about too much about like reinventing the wheel or buying a huge system or, thousands of hours of Big Four consulting, which is probably not what anyone ever needs. What people need is, as much information as possible targeted at the time of a decision, but not to try to replace the knowledge that they actually have about how their business operates.
Right. I think, Ganesh and I were talking a couple of days ago, and I think it's really important to make the distinction that this is something where it really just supports that human decision making with technology and data driven backed, decisions in the foreground. So that's something that's a really good distinction. We kind of talked a little bit about past traditional algorithms, our current practices. Where do you guys see scheduling in the future?
My view is that, like, if you're any sort of frontline worker or frontline manager or team manager or anything along those lines, ultimately the best use of your time is to be working with your team and in coaching, mentoring, teaching how the job should be done, giving feedback, and so on. And so scheduling, and I mean, most of the stuff we do at Workforce is scheduling, time sheeting, PTO management, all that stuff. It's all a necessary evil. Like, it has to be done, but it's not the point of the job. And so what we're trying to build is a world where there's as little friction as possible in that side, in, I guess, the back office, for lack of a better word, so that managers can work with their team. And that ultimately, managers working with their team and helping them get better at their jobs is what drives profitability, is what makes work best. Mm-hmm. So to answer your specific question, Meredith, I think the answer to the future of scheduling is much less of it, but it's not going to go away. It's not going to be fully replaced by machines. There's always going to be a human element to it. But I think we generally see it getting much quicker, much simpler, much more mobile. I think you have a topic about the metaverse in one of your future webinars. I don't know if it's going to go that far. But I think, like, the days of going on a computer and sitting and like clicking around in Excel for an hour, dragging shifts around, I think those days are on the way out. And the days of like tapping one or two buttons on your phone and having the same outcome are on the way in. But ultimately, it's always going to be about how we can help people on the front line make the right decision, as opposed to like trying to augment them or replace them or assume that their jobs can't even be automated fully.
Yeah. Just to extend that thought, I think in the future we would have if you take scheduling, the schedules would automatically be created algorithmically, and they would be presented to the users as recommendations for them to approve or change. So there's definitely going to be a human in the loop. But
Mhm.
I think to start off with, today we have humans building it with recommendations. We will move several steps forward where algorithms would automatically present the schedule and say, here's what I have put together based on information available. Would you agree? Would you like to make changes? So it's going to reverse the roles. And fast forward a few more years, I also, again, not perhaps in the direction of metaverse, but already you are seeing the trend of digital twins. Digital twins, in case you're not familiar with that, digital twins are replicas in the digital world of the actual, a real world entity or a process. So imagine a restaurant. We
Mhm.
have customers coming in and we have people serving them. If we were to create a digital replica of this restaurant and simulate the movement of customers, the service experience, and all of that, I can monitor this virtual restaurant and try and tweak the decision making within that. So I would imagine we are moving in that direction where there's constant data being collected about all of these entities, the people, the customers, the workers, and so on, and it's being recreated in this digital twin. And
Mhm.
it will also alert us about any likely failures or poor customer experience, so that people can go ahead and take a proactive decision to intervene. And at the same
Mm,
time, schedules will also be worked out that way, saying, hey, this is what the restaurant will look like tomorrow, the complete schedule of things. And based on this is how we worked out. Do you want to walk through some of these scenarios and understand why the recommendations are being given this way, and then accept or reject? So I'm foreseeing that happening very soon.
yeah. I think this last question, this poll question about how long scheduling takes is kind of
Mhm.
eye-opening, isn't it? As I think
Yeah.
there's certainly a long way to go if people are spending hours every week
Mhm.
on this problem. Um, I think a world where it takes minutes is kind of imaginable, but it's certainly not something we have today for many people. And so I guess my closing thought is, if you have a particularly what's the word? If you have a problem where it's kind of a well specified outcome of, we have a pretty strong idea of our demand and we can forecast, or it could be forecasted, how much work needs to be done right down to the task level. And I think
Mhm.
talking to Ganesh and to Gramino is a really good idea. And I think for the more general purpose scenario of, we have people working and getting paid hourly and we need to schedule them, but we don't necessarily have a great grasp on exactly how much, what's going to happen in the future, then we're like, at Workforce, we're trying to really build a product for those sorts of use cases. And our goal is to try and take this 3 to 4 hours a week problem and turn it into a 1 hour a week problem. And eventually it'll get simpler and maybe it'll be a one-click thing in the future. But even just
Mhm.
halving the time you spend on that really has a big impact, particularly if the results are better.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the overarching takeaway here is time and efficiency is, of the utmost importance now more than ever. And taking in that qualitative data as well with ever changing, life events such as COVID and the time we're living in now, it's crucial.